Thank you, and thank you in particular to Jennifer. This is a collaborative effort between 4 universities, but I know anyone that's been involved in the organising knows that the biggest effort for us was providing the name of our institutions and the logo, and everything else was down to Jennifer. So thank you very much, Jennifer, for the invitation and for organising such a great gathering. We're very much enjoying being here. So my paper is called Capitalism's Monstrous Engines, the Essential Nature of Corporations Reconsidered. And by even reading out the name, I've used up a minute of my time. So this will be a very potted, quick history with perhaps some time to talk about the implications of perhaps one way of understanding the company. But what do I mean when I say capitalism's monstrous engines? Well, if we think about capitalism, and of course, nearly everyone in this room studies the corporation, well, corporations are really the primary engine of capitalism, and they drive economies forward. And people talk about corporations being extractive, often with negative connotations. Of course, we know that they can transact as legal persons. They certainly aggregate value, and they certainly generate value. And one of the interesting discussions that perhaps sometimes doesn't happen is, so what's the balance of that? So there are people who genuinely believe they do nothing more than extract value from labour, from workers. And there are other people who believe that essentially corporations generate value and that's their primary, I guess, achievement. And of course, there are people that think the balance between all of those sits somewhere else. So I think that's one of those interesting kind of big questions, grand challenge questions, if you like, that perhaps could be engaged with more of those people who read the Harvard blog would have seen them last night. There was a posting where they basically talked about understanding corporations in this way was perhaps one of our grand challenges. So I thought that was interesting. It's corporations and the significance is increasingly mattering to more people beyond people in this room, corporate lawyers, international lawyers, public lawyers. So two competing conceptions of the corporation, and I think perhaps this is one of the challenges. So we all talk about companies or corporations, but very often we're talking about different things, because that underpin our understanding when we talk about a company or a corporation. And Chancellor William T. Allen rather famously wrote an article, The Schizophrenic Nature of the Corporation, where he kind of set out those differences, and they're quite difficult to reconcile, aren't they? And there are many competing theories of the company, but you could say they divide into two groups. You could say that there's a property conception of the company and there's a social entity conception of the company. And if the private property conception of the company would see that the company is the private property of shareholders, that its purpose is to advance the purposes of those owners, those shareholders, which is of course predominantly to increase their wealth. The function of directors, it follows, is to advance the financial interests of the owners. And as I'll try and show in the time I have here, that kind of form of company has its origins in the contractual forms or the unincorporated forms of the company that existed alongside the incorporated form throughout the modern history, and by modern I mean 500 or 600 year history of the modern company. And then you have the other conception, the social entity conception, I think is the way that Chancellor Allen described it. Corporations are not the private property of shareholders. So, these are hard to reconcile. Corporations are not, their purpose is actually not to advance the interests of the owner shareholders, but in fact they're social institutions that are not wholly private because they have a public purpose. Their existence depends on government concurrence through the act of incorporation. The key attributes of the corporation are derived in some way from the state rather than privately acquired through contract and couldn't be acquired through contract. And corporations in this way are capable of bearing legal and moral obligations. So that other social entity conception has its origins, I believe, in the persona ficta, the artificial legal person, and the early corporation, the early business corporation being a subset of the early corporations that were used for public purposes during the 15th, 16th, 17th century. So those are those two competing conceptions, and as you see, hard to reconcile, but maybe we can try. So the key features, and turning now to the kind of merits of the two conceptions, there's no question that the key features of the modern corporation were drawn from the old incidents of corporations, a much earlier form that even pre-existed business corporations. And those features that existed in all corporations or universitas was the right to sue or be sued, having a common seal. Of course, common seals matter less, but they were a feature till recently. Entering into transactions as a corporation, dealing with land and making what they called bylaws, internal rules, where companies retain that right. And it's called bylaws in some jurisdictions, articles and so forth in others. The benefit, probably a primary benefit, is the benefit of perpetual succession that the company, which meant the company itself, not just perpetual succession for the members, but that the company or corporation itself could exist in perpetuity, which is hugely significant, could exist potentially forever, outliving the humans that were its members, its governing body, and so forth. So all those characteristics of the modern company don't come from the contractual form and predate even the business corporation. So when we mention this term persona ficta, where did that come from? So persona ficta, artificial legal person, what I think is the earliest modern corporation in the sense it had all the key features of the modern company. The English East India Company was a persona ficta, or an artificial legal person. Business corporations were a subset of corporations that were used for multiple purposes. And in the case of Sutton's Hospital in 1612, Chief Justice Cook, as he was then, introduced that concept into the common law. So Maitland, the wonderful F.W. Maitland, described persona ficta, or artificial legal person, as the Italian theory of the company. So it was an early legal transplant. It was derived from Roman law originally, but altered and changed by the canonists, who applied it to contemporary issues besetting the church. So for example, if you've got a group of rogue priests, what does that tell you about the church? So a desire to separate the church from the priests who are part of it. So that same separation concept that becomes significant for corporate law. Pope Innocent IV, who was originally a lawyer, led that development. And it meant after 1612, in the case of Sutton's Hospital, when he introduced this concept into the common law, that all corporations, whether they were business corporations or other forms of corporation, existed in the abstract separate from their members. That was the understanding from 1612 of what a corporation was. Now, the other part of the puzzle, and if you like, the private part of the puzzle, is what could be termed a corporate fund. So double entry bookkeeping, and of course we've got a tour to look at the origins of some of this, but double entry bookkeeping developed originally in Italy, but entered England in the middle of the 16th century. And this idea of joint stock, as they called it then, or a corporate fund of the company that was seeded by the capital of shareholders, well, that was separated for accounting purposes in the corporation from the investors. So that kind of separation, but here of the fund, the money, not a legal separation, but certainly an accounting separation that was facilitated by double entry bookkeeping. And not all forms of corporation use double entry bookkeeping. People talk about the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, being the first modern corporation, but in fact, they used Hanseatic bookkeeping. They didn't use double entry bookkeeping. So you could argue they lacked that key feature of separation of what you could call the corporate fund. So the English East India Company by 1657 had permanent capital. It was a persona ficta, an artificial legal person, like all corporations that were chartered or incorporated. And with the double entry bookkeeping, the corporate fund was separated from the investors. So you could certainly argue that it was a separate legal and accounting entity from all shareholders, and with all those other key features carried forward in the corporation form, was the first modern company. So here's someone, a favourite person for many people in the room, Oliver Cromwell. And Oliver Cromwell is significant historically for many reasons, but one of perhaps the less known ones is that he signed a new charter. The East India Company began in 1600, but its new charter in 1657. And at that point, he essentially gave the East India Company permanent capital. And at that point, it was it acquired all the key features of the modern company. So what did it mean when you talk about it was a modern company and this idea of what's public and what's private? Well, the reality is that all forms of entity used for business have always been an interweaving of the public and the private. Corporateness and corporation was originally, or perhaps always, derived from the Crown or Parliament or the state in some form, originally by charters, letters, patents, or statutory instruments. Case of Sutton's Hospital, The 1612 case determined that companies, all corporations, were artificial legal persons, and then corporations like the English East India Company that were chartered with permanent capital they were chartered trading corporations. So what did it mean for the English East India Company? So here's to finish really with a short case study of and of course there are many reasons to explain the success of the East India Company after 1657. But clearly from the history, it limped along before 1657. The Civil War and unrest in England and Britain probably contributed. But there's no question that after 1657, it rapidly outstripped and grew not just other corporations in England, but also other forms of East India Company. So of course there was the English or the British East India Company, but there was also a Portuguese, a Dutch East India Company. So it is interesting to compare the performance of the English East India Company with other East India companies from other mighty powers of the time. So the English East India Company had its permanent capital in 1657. After Cromwell died and they brought back the king, it got another charter with permanent capital in 1661. 1662, it declared a dividend of 20%, and also significantly for the first time, the principle that those distributions from that point on would not be divisions where capital and income were not distinguished, had been the practice in the past, but in fact that those divisions, those dividends would not be from the capital but from profit. And when the first dividend was declared, the governor stated that a division of 20% in money can be made without touching the capital. So we have that notion of capital entering corporate law or the idea of corporations and generally into commerce. And then between 1664 and 1667, the company returned amounts equivalent to 2/3 of its paid in capital of £500,000 to shareholders. This is massive, massive return for those fortunate investing shareholders. And then between 1657 and 1691, proprietors in the East India Company, the shareholders received 840% in dividends on their original investment. 50% dividends were paid in 1680, 1682, 1689, 1691. Company's share price quadrupled from £60 odd in 1664 to £245 in 1677 and £300 in 1680. And in 1682, the permanent capital was doubled by the issue of bonus shares. And I haven't got a graph here, but the trajectory of the East India Company from sitting third in the league of the East India companies behind the Portuguese and the Dutch, by the end of the 17th century, in those 30 odd years since it got permanent capital, it had almost caught up with the massive Dutch East India Company. So also, although there was the option in the first 7 years for the original shareholders to, if you like, be bought back, but have their shares bought back by the East India Company, after 7 years, no one wanted their shares bought back for obvious reasons. The shares became transferable and the secondary market shares developed. And interestingly also, the English East India Company became widely held. So the largest holding was £4,000 in nominal value of shares, of course. And then the people round the period, Josiah Child, who was one of the early governors of the East India Company, wrote in an anonymous pamphlet in 1701 that the East India trade will become an instrument of capital accumulation. It's talking about capital, and would act as a stimulation for industrial development and higher productivity. And Child termed the English East India Company as a fund of wealth. So here we have, I believe, modern capitalism. I'll finish there. Thank you.